Hello, everyone. Hello, Sylvia. Good morning, good morning. Looks like some folks are still trickling in a little bit. It's great to see so many people come out this morning. I was just in conversation, I checked my watch, and I'm like, hey, it's start time. So here we are. This is our second Coffee and Conversation of the season. So welcome to those who are just joining us today, and welcome back for folks who were here last week. It's been really fun to see this program get such a nice, loyal following over time. I should say, my name's Sean Keeley. I'm an alum here, and I'm also the Dean of Institutional Advancement, and I get to kind of put on a bunch of summer events with a really wonderful team. Today, we've been looking forward to a conversation around this topic. So land justice is on the slate for today, and couldn't have anyone really better to kind of help walk us through this than Darren Ranco. So grateful to have you here, Darren. And we have Todd Little-Siebold, our faculty member, and I have a blank on my notes because I was going to say Todd's been a faculty member since, and I forgot to ask you, Todd.
A long time.
Oh. That doesn't count.
Many seasons.
Yeah, don't let him get away with that.
27 years.
Here we go, 27 years. So Todd's led a number of conversations here at the college, and when I think of Todd, so I'm not on the academic team, but I pay close enough attention, I like to think, that I think of Todd as someone who really exemplifies our interdisciplinary approach to education. He certainly is sort of anchors the curriculum from a historical perspective. He's a historian and certainly fills that role, but he collaborates across the college, and even beyond the college, and that's sort of one of the great things he brings to our college. So things like being our faculty director for the Fund for Maine Islands, which is a collaboration with the Island Institute, and a lot of great team teaching. There's many projects that I'll encourage you to ask Todd about. Ask him about mapping ocean stories, ask him about the Navigating Change Monster course that recently took place. And then there's this really cool project that I just have to say a few things about that has to do with apples. And so Todd has a true love of apples and genetics, and he is leading a really cool effort in the state of Maine to gather and then map the genetic lineage of apples here in the state, and it's feeding into a national sort of database, a national project across the country, and it's a really interesting way to understand how apples traverse this country, and it tells us a lot about human history. So I'll maybe leave it there. I feel like I'm going on way too long. So Todd, thanks for doing this. Darren, thank you for being here, being back on campus, because you've certainly been here plenty. And I will leave it to you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Sean, thank you for that kind introduction. So I would encourage you at some point to look up Darren's CV, because he is, I think, sort of a model of what I would call scholar activists, people who engage profoundly with intellectual, sort of pressing intellectual questions, but also then bring them to bear in the world that we live in. In that regard, he's sort of a natural ally, supporter for the kinds of things that we do at the College of the Atlantic. And I'm actually going to introduce him more as a colleague and friend, because what I would say is that Darren has sort of embodied for me the tradition of a sort of supportive intellectual interlocutor who has challenged us at the college to be better and do better around Native history, Wabanaki sovereignty, those sorts of things, in a way that I can only describe as the quintessence of diplomacy. And I wrote this and I tried to think about it that, when I called Darren and said, hey, I'd love to talk with you, we're thinking about an Indigenous Studies initiative, which all kinds of people do. He runs the Wabanaki Center at UMO, does lots of work around leadership, tribal thought leadership and political leadership through the Wabanaki Alliance, and the list goes on. But I think that sort of what I said was the remonstrance to do better, the sort of challenge for a historically white institution like College of the Atlantic to show up and to listen has just been a delight. We're both sort of came out of academia in some of the same debates. My training in Latin American history, particularly with an emphasis on social, racial dynamics in colonial Latin America. We know a lot of the same people. He worked with one of my close mentors, John Watanabe at Dartmouth. And as we went through, I was like, oh, we come from the same sort of moment, but then obviously as an Indigenous scholar, Darren has had other work that he has had to carry. And all I have to say, he's done that with me, with poise and grace, and always says, yes, I can help you with that. He's helped us to develop a scholarship program for Wabanaki kids, tuition waiver program, just helped walk our admissions team and financial aid team through that in really concrete ways. So to me, it is just an honor and a delight to welcome Darren back to College of the Atlantic. He's been here several times, engaged with us. He was here this weekend for the Dawnland Festival, which if you came was amazing. So, and this particular topic is incredibly interesting to me as a historian, because really land justice and land return was not something that was being talked about publicly in the East, in Maine, even a few short years ago in public. I'm sure behind closed doors, tribal leaders and others were talking about how land justice and reparative justice, what it would look like. But as I said to Darren, as we were just chatting before this, to me, what's fascinating is the visibility of this issue has just been radically transformed in the last 2 to 3 years. And to me, this is a really interesting moment that connects sort of reparative justice questions and the questions of the sovereignty of tribal nations, and particularly the sovereignty of tribal nations in Maine. Maine is an extreme outlier in the United States. Our state government has opposed tribal sovereignty consistently. We're going to talk a little bit about why that is. The federally recognized tribes in Maine do not benefit in the same ways that federally recognized tribes around the rest of the country do, because of the opposition of the state of Maine, and currently because of the opposition of Governor Janet Mills. So we're going to talk about that uncomfortable truth of why Maine is such an outlier in basically resisting tribal sovereignty, but also the more hopeful story of this place's, MDI's place in sort of the growth of a land conservation movement that now is connecting to questions of basically sovereignty and tribal justice. Let me say one other thing. I think this is always a little awkward. Historically, white organizations often have to grapple with land acknowledgements, the fact that we are in what has historically been the homelands of Wabanaki people for thousands of years. In fact, this area was sort of the epicenter of a place connecting tribal peoples all the way up into the Maritimes, down into New England. So MDI and the Penobscot River was sort of the epicenter of a place connected by kin and relationships and alliance that spread throughout the Northeast, throughout Algonquin-speaking people. So interestingly, we're in Wabanaki homeland, but also in a sort of central connecting nodal place for tribal people. And to me, one of the things that raises for us as an institution is what is our obligation to honor the welcome that we have here in Wabanaki homeland. So I'd like everybody to sort of think about that, because I don't think we often think of where we sit as other people's homeland. So it's an uncomfortable truth. I mean, why we get to be here, why we get to have this land is because it was taken after the 7 Years' War from the Wabanaki people who had successfully defended it for 150 years from European encroachment. Period. That's the reason. And this ongoing sovereignty debate and the question of land return goes back to this reality that the French turned out to be able to more or less coexist with the Wabanaki because the Wabanaki were equal partners. And as soon as the English showed up, that was over. And the series of broken promises begins before that and extends to today. So that's my little land acknowledgement and history lesson. So I thought that I would ask you first, Darren, to talk about the emergence of land justice as a theme in tribal national politics, and particularly the question of land return as an element of reparative justice.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the really kind introduction. Great to be here this morning. I came for the coffee and staying for the conversation, obviously. They're like, sit here, you get to talk about stuff. I mean, it's a really important and great question, and I really appreciate your framing of an acknowledgement in terms of where we are at. Yeah, this place is so important, and we, as Wabanaki people, we, even after the takings, we've returned again and again, and at times we are welcomed here, at times we are not, and so I feel very welcome in this space. I think we can really, it's always where to begin the story. Yeah. I'll just say this, there was basically, after World War II, there was an attempt to basically get rid of tribes as entities. It was called the termination era. And that was resisted very well and we talked about this in the panel on Sunday, by a number of indigenous leaders who had fought in World War II and had connected with one another across tribal nations, and then were able to form coalitions and engagements where the energy around the post-World War II civil rights movement in indigenous communities looked somewhat different, but it was ultimately about maintaining ourselves in our homelands and fighting for justice in that regard. And so I think you see then in the 50s, 60s, and beyond, these moments at a community level, which then intersect with sort of the trends of both national frameworks of indigenous people's justice. There's the rise of our civil rights movement as indigenous people in the US is called the Red Power movement. But I mean, those elements are, and that gets really recognized in the 70s, but those elements of it pre-exists, where, there's the Wounded Knee 2 standout, there's the occupation of Alcatraz and the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. Like, these are the highlights of that movement. But at its core, there is this national movement towards, and some of this is captured in legislation for the Indian Claims Commission. So there is a legal mechanism to regain lands. I mean, it was a classic strategy of, not wanting a bunch of different lawsuits that might have very big impacts by federalizing the claims and sort of, grouping them all together. It was to minimize the harm to those who would be on the hook for illegal takings. And in some ways, our Settlement Act, that was signed in 1980, was a part of that larger post-World War II debate, where very clearly 2/3 of the state of Maine had been signed away, quote unquote, in illegal treaties, basically starting in the 1790s. So even though we didn't participate in the Indian Claims Commission, my good friend and colleague, and I was just thinking about Bob, John Banks says that, for him, the first land return kind of piece for us, obviously, was the Settlement Act. I mean, the way it was written and the way it's been interpreted, obviously, we're not in favor of the the implications for our sovereignty. But in terms of, for Passamaquoddy tribe and Penobscot Nation, that allowed for, with federal dollars, us to repurchase lands, put those lands into our tribal holdings, and be able to manage them through both contemporary and traditional methods, which is sort of how the tribes manage land. So, that is here in Maine, but I think that represents nationally for sure, and then internationally to a lesser extent. I think what you find in the 1970s, there is this real push towards indigenous rights at the United Nations, and the very first sort of contours of that are when there's a permanent commission on sort of treaty rights in 1977, starts at the UN. So I think you see some of those, that process basically ends with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was, became an international treaty, 30 years later, 2007, right? So that idea that there are these fundamental rights for Indigenous people in engaging, and part of those fundamental rights are rights of access, rights of territory, rights of legal, a right to legally take the harm of takings into courts, either at national levels or international levels. So I think you see that very much, but you see that as a reaction to the settler and colonial institutions, right? Mm-hmm. So our mechanisms for that are a lawsuit, a claim in a court, So, as this work has developed in the last 40, 50 years, what you see then is a recentering of the why do we do this work as Indigenous people? So I'm the executive director of the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship. Our focus is, we have representation from each of the tribes here in what is now Maine to facilitate land return. And we're not interested in land return as tribal nations because we love being property owners, right? It is for the idea that we are in the process of rematriating our lands, right? Which is to say, we are fulfilling our promises and responsibility to caretake for these places, and that involves often things like access to traditional foods and plants and medicines, that sort of thing. But it is our role and our teachings is if we take care of it, it will take care of us. So because we've been locked out of all the lands, including all these conservation lands, right? The land return movement and the rematriation, I'm calling rematriation, and land justice movements are as much about transforming the idea of property relations as they are about simply, returning lands to tribal control in, the idea that property and sovereignty is about keeping people out. In the indigenous frameworks, why we talk about it as land justice or as land return and rematriation is because that's just the first step. The actual steps are about our caretaking roles and responsibilities across the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I don't know if I answered your question.
That's a good start.
Okay.
One of the things
He's
that
grading me, I think.
No. I'm trying to figure out how to follow all the themes that you laid out, because to me, one of the things that I think is quite interesting about the work that as I became aware of it, there's an organization called First Light that began a conversation with conservation organizations about why conservation organizations in Maine and elsewhere controlled more land than tribal nations. And because MDI has a sort of origin story around land conservation, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, many conservation organizations, even Acadia, Peter Forbes and the First Light really asked this question: why do conservation organizations conserve, and for whom? Which is a pretty uncomfortable question, right? Because it's like, well, here's this beautiful view from fill-in-the-blank town of a beautiful set of islands, some of which were reserved to the Penobscot Nation in treaty rights, but don't belong to them. So First Light was one of the catalysts that began a conversation here in Maine, particularly around land trusts and their obligations to engage with tribal nations. And what I became aware of was very interesting was that First Light did this thing called First Light Learning Journey, which was really to educate conservation leaders around questions of indigenous land ownership and the expropriation of indigenous lands. So I thought that actually would be an interesting topic to sort of explore a little bit, because it's fascinating to me, and Darren's worked very closely with two COA graduates, Ellie Oldock and Brett Ciccatelli, who are working as two of the three or four staff members at First Light to sort of bring into being supporting processes to support the work of the work that Darren and others are doing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about First Light and allyship and what that might look like. What it looks like.
No, and it also allows me to back up a little. Like I think, and by the way, COA grads, thank you all for those people. They're just do such amazing and important work. I think in backing up, and thinking about what the movement for Indigenous people looks like, is that after UNDRIP, or maybe even before that, there was a move by a number of Indigenous people in the aftermath of things like the closing of the Indian Claims Commission and all this sort of thing. Is one of the routes that tribes were actually going was to create their own land trusts and conservation groups. That was much more popular out west, where there are some tools for land trusts there that have to do with actual forms of conservation easements that allow for cultural practices. That's not the situation here in the East. None of the state laws that govern conservation easements allow for the kind of intense cultural practices that you have, especially in California, but in other Western states. So that was sort of phase one, and then people learned out of that even with those particular laws in place for cultural practice and access, that land trusts are beholden to a whole set of state and outside regulatory constructs, and that really violate some of the cultural norms of Indigenous people. So, out of that learning curve, and there's Beth Rose Middleton wrote this book called Trust in the Land. And she basically, it came out more than 10 years ago now, but she documented that sort of first wave of Indigenous land trusts and the work they were doing, but also the restrictions on that work in terms of it not fulfilling the promise of, we now have this land to do what we want. So that a bunch of different things have happened in the ensuing decade. Some of them are movements that, for example, here in Maine, where we were able to create the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, right? So the removal of major dams on the Penobscot River, where an Indigenous nation, my tribe, the Penobscot Nation, was a key leader and partner in the removal of dams. And so working with conservation groups to do that, and oftentimes working with conservation groups that, the year before, 2 years before, were testifying against our sovereignty in the state legislature. So there's this sort of big hurdle for us to trust them in engaging and being in allies for that. So, but that project though really shifted, I think, a lot of hearts and minds, the ability to work together and them recognizing that, hey, actually tribal sovereignty, if we want lands, if we want open rivers, if we want better environments, tribal sovereignty acting in the space is a really important thing. And so I think that was a really, I'm sure people have their own stories about that. Then fast forward to 2017, when the First Light people some of them were already here in Maine. Peter Forbes had been doing work, out west mostly for a number of years. engaging with Wabanaki people, saying, we know you don't, you've had some rough times with conservation and land trust groups. There's this other way to do it. And we want to sort of embark on a transformational dialogue with land trust, but are you interested? Can you imagine a way forward? I think we had, especially Passamaquoddy tribe with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, been protecting things like petroglyphs and that sort of work. So there was a little bit of kind of momentum or possibility there. But many Wabanaki people, you mentioned, I say yes. Our diplomacy is to maybe we do it too much because we are so. Yeah. Our diplomacy is very welcoming, and it is about dialogue. We believe in dialogue, but sometimes we're just negotiating with ourselves, and that can be painful. But I will say that that began a process whereby that work has been shaped by a number of Indigenous Wabanaki leaders and educators throughout the state. And I always joke with Peter, the kind of work he does is he has the hard conversations, right? Mm-hmm. He didn't shy away from like, hey, this group was against your sovereignty 3 years ago. What do they say about it now? That idea is you have to have those discussions before you can do that work. So, we really helped shape that engagement with land trusts and conservation groups, the education, the idea that, conserving lands, locks us out as Indigenous people from our cultural practices. The idea that we protected all these lands, right? The national park or the national monument, or we can't access those lands and practice our traditional cultures. We're just now getting to, after many, many years, right? Those sweetgrass access agreements are starting to kind of come into focus. Right, they just did notice and comment, right? I think it just ended around an access agreement for sweetgrass harvesting on Acadia, in Acadia National Park for Wabanaki people. So that's a big advancement, but that required many years of research, us proving that we don't harm sweetgrass, which is crazy. It's so crazy because my good friend and my former student, Suzanne Greenlaw, her work in the park, she documented what we know from our cultural teachings is that when we harvest sweetgrass in our way, it actually returns more plentifully. And so the idea that we would harm, of course, we're progenitor, we're part of the system that makes it even possible. And I think that's the education of when settlers showed up here, it was this amazing place, such natural beauty, but that reflected thousands of years of Indigenous stewardship and engagement and practices of the place as well. So I think shifting hearts and minds relies on starting the history of environmental action much earlier than what we would normally think about that. Mm-hmm. But one thing I'll say, and just we can move to another part of this, is that for those First Light organizations, that First Light learning journey is probably unique in nationally. So one of my roles in doing this work and facilitating, again, I'm serving on the Wabanaki side of this. The commission is a representation of the Wabanaki tribal governments. But when I traveled around and talked to other Indigenous people across the country, there isn't a First Light for most of them. Yeah. There isn't a group that is saying, we need to have that hard conversation, start out from there, and we need to transform what we do and recognize that land return is a critical piece of the goals of what we want to happen in the world. That clearly, I don't know when the first conservation easement happened. I think it's, 70, 80 years. I don't know. But I think we've done all this work to put lands in under these easements to protect them as conservation. We didn't prevent this, the climate catastrophe. We didn't, it takes some self-critique to realize we also need to be doing something different and engaging in different ways. So I think, I just can't say enough about how amazing this transformation in land trusts and conservation groups has been in what we now call Maine. I mean, not everyone is 100% on board all the time, but the principles and the hard work, again, the COA grads, this has been really transformational. But it's also, we do this together. And I'll just say, I think I've mentioned this in many, many talks, like the First Light group and the Wabanaki Commission group, we see our work as interdependent, and that we would share, like, in the two-row wampum kind of approach. Like, we each need to be in our spaces doing our action for our ship and canoe, or our two ships, to go forward together. One can't be over the other. At some points in this work, First Light has said, like, hey, we set this whole thing up, like, can we go away now? And we're like, no, you're in it till we fix all this, which, probably not going to be fixed. But the idea that we maintain these difficult discussions and move forward with the work, and we're some of this is the critiques that I think Indigenous people and organizations often have, is like, sometimes we become really a hot topic for a year or two, and then people move on with their resources and their efforts and their time, and we're like, we're here for the long haul.
Right.
You're going to be here for the long haul to do this work with us. And I think that's been a learning curve. And also, it's a huge learning curve for us. We don't have institutional frameworks for land coming back to us.
Right.
It's been going the other direction for a really long time. So the idea that, we are also engaging in a complex set of diplomacies and engagements where land return is functionally appropriate for us and meets those goals of our caretaking responsibilities is really important. But I have nothing but, we double down, triple down on those hard conversations, the engagement that they require.
Yeah, let me say one more thing about this, about First Light. How I became aware of it is, so I teach Native American history here, and one of the people who's been very kind and generous with his time is Donald Soktoma of the Passamaquoddy tribe at what's historically called Indian Township. And Donald had published a history of the Passamaquoddy people that basically, when he was tribal representative, he just went into the state archives and collected absolutely everything that he could find. And in it was a small mention from a newspaper of a massacre at Walker Pond over in Brooksville. So I don't know if you've been to Deer Isle, you go up over Caterpillar Hill, you have this beautiful view of Penobscot Bay. Right below that is Walker Pond, which was this epicenter of Wabanaki communities. It was their sort of gathering place, but also probably the most significant indigenous community in the Northeast, in the northeastern part of New England, called Archimagam. And the English basically come in and attempt to kill every man, woman, and child. And I was like, wait, why don't I know about this? And I was like, oh, because nobody tells this story. Everybody's talking about Jonathan Fisher and his beautiful furniture. And so the European American, though people say, the first white child born here, essentially after the English systematically used violence from 1690 to 1760 to basically try to extinguish the Wabanaki people by paying 25 pounds for a scalp of a dead Wabanaki, 15 pounds only for a child. So the fundamental violence behind this, so I approached Blue Hill Heritage Trust and said, hey, you all have an easement on Walker Pond. Do you want to tell a story that matters? And they were like, yeah, sure. Hans Carlson from Blue Hill Heritage Trust was engaged in First Light, and he said, yeah, I'm doing this work. So
also a very good historian.
Also a very good historian, anthropologist who is interested in these sorts of things. I think also Maine Coast Heritage Trust was right there on these. So one of the things that's fascinating to me about this is that, and then in the park with Becky Cole-Will as leader of resources, natural resources, she's an archaeologist that was, again, right there saying, okay, let's see how we can restore traditional access to sweetgrass as a first step of looking at traditional use and these cultural practices. And one of the things that I think is fascinating when you think about it, someplace like Baxter State Park, Katahdin is a sacred space. And what do people do? They walk up and they walk down and they shoot champagne. What if it's a world in which the Wabanaki get to say what people get to do on their sacred summit? And this was when I was just like, dope. Like, this is something we really need to attend to, that our students need to learn about, in a way of thinking about what does traditional use look like and who gets to decide, right? And this is one of the things that I think is fascinating to me. Conservation has historically not meant use. It's mean experiencing. It's mean, floating your boat in front of an island or walking on a trail. And this engagement, I think, is really interesting when you think about the caretaking and stewardship. Obviously, our conservation organizations have in mind a kind of stewardship, right? And to me, one of the things that's fascinating about the work that Darren and Suzanne Greenlaw have begun to do is say, no. We can prove scientifically that our cultural practices are restorative, are part of a healthy biodiverse environment. To me, obviously, one of the things that the tribes have to prove that to anybody is repugnant, but it's the reality of the current reality of places like Acadia National Park. And I think that one thing I would say that I have seen as well is that Darren and others, Donna Loring from the Penobscot Nation, James Francis from the Penobscot Nation, have worked really closely with the new Katahdin Woods and Waters to have, at least my impression, a better starting place for a place that's conserved. Maybe that's something you could talk a little bit about. They're about to launch a new visitor center that's entirely indigenous design.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, part of these histories, and I'll just say a couple of things that I think in the 2000s, I tell one of the stories as in 2007, the World Bank issued a report about indigenous people and biodiversity, and they basically, these are statistics that people are familiar with and often repeat, and it's a correlation kind of approach or study where people maybe have heard this, that indigenous peoples are about 4% of the world's population. They occupy or have some sort of decision making over 20 to 22% of the terrestrial lands in the world, and on those lands are where 80% of the world's biodiversity exists, right? So that idea of indigenous people caretaking biodiversity, I think, has been a scholarly and a practitioner debate in conservation groups since then. For whatever reason, that report had a big influence. There's also work in the various international biodiversity agreements work that also really shaped this idea. And so I think since then, there's been this, scholarship growing around what that actually, what motivates that, what makes that, protection of biodiversity really possible in indigenous homelands, with indigenous people having a lot of control and say over management and access and that sort of work. So, and then they're resistors, it's scholarly type and practitioner type things. They're resistors to that. Happy to address any of your questions if you have that. But I think for me that that debate sets the stage for then a place like Katahdin Woods and Waters, having a framework or a story. I mean, also made possible through the generosity of the Quimby family in terms of who's funding this visitor contact station. Very clearly not possible. The Park Service wasn't going to invest, I don't know how many millions of dollars at this contact station, but also do a design framework that was basically by and for indigenous Wabanaki people And I was telling Bob, I was like, you have to visit this place when it's open. It's like, I actually think it's going to embarrass the framework of interpretation that Acadia has. Because simply, you come to Acadia and you tell a story about nature, maybe the Rockefellers or some heroes of preservation are mentioned, right? And then that's it. It's Maine's beauty. It's that sort of thing. The contact station at Katahdin Woods and Waters is like, you are in Wabanaki homelands. That is the consistent and permanent message. And this is how Wabanaki people understand this place. This is how it connects to all of us as Wabanaki people across the landscape. And that story as the key framing story to a national monument is very different. I'm not saying Acadia doesn't do anything with Wabanaki. I'm just saying the key fundamental story for the monument is Wabanaki. And so, that shift represents this ability to, reframe and go back further in terms of why are we here? Why are these places important? Why are we trying to protect them and through what means? And so, again, that's speaking to a moment, which is as much about, I keep forgetting things I want to point out, the 2007 World Bank report, Dakota Access Pipeline, right? Yeah. This rising up of media attention around the ongoing harms to Indigenous people of our fossil fuel economies and our, the presumed sacrifice that we as Indigenous people must make towards a modern, energy system. I think also the reckonings of the summer of 2020. I think people want to make action. They want to transform. They see institutional harms created that are very old, and our people want to do and act in ways to fix them. And that involves some very serious engagements and discussions for that work. So I strongly encourage everyone to visit that contact station, because it'll show what's possible. I guess that's what I was saying. And it's sort of this state-of-the-art narration. It's also backed up by, and I know there are Wabanaki critiques of like, hey, they only put us in the, in the shop at the end of the experience. Like that is a really good critique in many efforts that are about representation, but we don't get the land, we get the gift shop or whatever. But there is more to it than that as well, because there is a framework pre-existing as the monument comes into its management of access, cooperative management, cooperative stewardship. Like those things are also ongoing. So it won't be, 100 whatever years later of where we get a sweetgrass study. What I'm saying? Like this is going to be pre-baked into it, in a way that Acadia, previous Lafayette, like that this is pre-baked into the framing of the monument as well. So, maybe it starts out with minimal, but it is set up in such a way, to the extent that the laws that govern such places, which again, the practice of, we currently have an Indigenous person at the head of the Interior, Indigenous person at the head of the Park Service. I mean, these are possibilities of transformation that we haven't quite seen. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, well, they fixed everything in day one. Clearly not. But, there are these possibilities, and just seeing them is part of what sparks the imagination for all of us to say like, this is possible now. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask one more question that's relatively pointed and fairly political, because we want to leave a little bit of time for you all to ask questions. So one of the things that most of you may or may not be aware of is that there's been a very strong push by the tribes to transform their relationship to the state of Maine so that they have full sovereignty. For the first time in Maine's history, the leadership of the House and Senate pushed through legislation basically to treat Wabanaki tribes equally as any other federally recognized tribes, and Governor Janet Mills, without much explanation, vetoed it. And the coalition could not override the veto Similarly, Jared Golden introduced legislation, federal legislation, to do the same thing, and Angus King killed it. So it is very important for you all to know that this work, which I find incredibly hopeful, and I believe to be the way forward because it's really about walking together, walking forward together, has had really powerful opponents in political positions of power that, in general, I think many of us admire much of the work that they're doing, but in terms of their actual performance, their actual delivery on this, are really reflecting kind of a 19th century, 18th century mentality towards Native people. And one of the things that I love about my relationship with Darren is I was able to ask him, he came to talk with a friend of a colleague who came from Oberlin to speak with my class, and I said, so why did Angus kill the federal legislation? What is Janet Mills' game? Like, why the hell, after all these years, is our leadership opposing against a legislature that I think was bipartisan, but not bipartisan enough? So one of the things that I asked Darren, if I could ask this, is like, what's the game that Maine's leadership is playing, and what are they afraid of?
So just to clarify, the Golden legislation was only to be treated, only to make it so the state couldn't oppose us being recognized in legislation that affects tribal nations going forward. Meaning, there's a clause in the Settlement Act that says, going forward, the tribes are not presumptively be able to benefit from federal legislation related to being federally recognized tribes, unless the tribes are mentioned by name in the legislation. If not, then the state can basically say that federal law impacts our ability as the state of Maine to exercise our full sovereignty. The Golden Bill was simply saying, it doesn't even look back. It didn't even go back to since 1980, let's include them. It was like going forward, let's include them and make them sort of whole in the idea of going forward. So it was actually a very small, small kind of bill. And then, Senator King, I think, was trying to reckon what he was going to do. There was a lot of tribal outreach to him, and I sent some messages that he wouldn't champion it per se, but wouldn't oppose it. But at the end of the day, I think in speaking with, and this was his rationale, he said, in speaking with the governor and her administration, we would prefer that these things happen first at the state level. I think that was his official position. So, it's always hard to imagine what is in people's hearts, especially politicians. I'm not going to mention, we all know politicians say things and then they do things, whatever. I'll just say what I said on Sunday at first, which is, when people say we wouldn't support this, it feels very much like they don't trust us. In terms of the reactions, the various reactions, and I see this at the state level and people resisting our move towards sovereignty, environment is one of the things that they are worried about. Our ability, again, Bob Getzel and I worked at EPA, our ability to have our own tribal environmental standards, which would be treated like states' environmental standards, and having that kind of sovereign control over the pollution in our environments as tribes. I've heard both things from the state's position resisting, is that we would either be just so lax environmentally that we're just anything could happen. We're gonna do open pit mining on every piece of the reservation or whatever. So there's that worry. The other worry is also that we would be too environmentally strict, and therefore no business could ever operate in the state of Maine. the idea that you can accuse people and resist their ability to self-determine and accuse them of both things is dehumanization at its core, because you're not actually paying attention to that. You're just filling in the category of that other with whatever you think is the scariest thing. I don't know, I guess politicians do that. Wonder why. But the idea that we have this kind of ongoing struggle of people engaging in those surreptitious framings of fear, oh, it's, sometimes I read, some of the detractors will say, oh, it's complicated because it'll be checkerboarded because the tribal handholdings are all across the state, and we're like, oh, but that exists everywhere across Indian country. Like they figured it out. It's like a thing, but multiple environmental regulations of people right next to each other. Well, we were right next to the state of New Hampshire too, and we've been able to figure out like their standards and our standards. The ideas that they come up with to scare people and say it's wrong or bad is dehumanization. I'm not gonna go more into like what is in someone's hearts or minds, but the category sits so comfortably in resisting our self-determination that it blows my mind. And that people kind of let it, even in our media, kind of let it kind of happen in real time to be like, this is a serious position. This lawyer says, checkerboarding and we need to go slowly. I always think like, what would Janet Mills have said in the civil rights era, which very much was like a huge part of mainstream America, was like, we know it's wrong, but we need to go slowly, right? We need to go, well, this little piece, maybe voting, right? And then housing, and then this thing. And would she have been happy with that? Would she reflect upon the risks and demands for justice and tell those people, yes, you need to wait and go slow because we're not sure we trust you, because we're not sure about the implication of this bill or that bill. And I think she would be horrified that I would make that thing, because I think she sees herself as an advocate in that space. But this is the same space, it's just us. And I think that approach that they're saying they want, like we have to negotiate a different bill for each little of the 22 pieces of that legislation, I think it speaks a lot to this othering and the way that our self-determination is treated. And so I don't want to, I am a state employee. I work at the University of Maine. So, I have tenure, maybe it'll be harder for them to really get rid of me. But, I just, to that extent, I don't get it. I can't say what's in someone's, I don't get it. I can't defend it. I know what their arguments are, and I find them all completely made up and spurious. But, okay. That's how we've lived, right, in this world. So, I'm very hopeful, though. What has been accomplished in these last two or three sessions of the legislature, that coalition, and maybe we're at the end of it. There's a possibility like those majorities and the left kind of dictating in the Democratic Party in Maine, maybe that's going away for some time. I don't know. It feels like it possibly could. But we've made gains, and I think we've made, and we continue to make gains where the land return efforts, we returning Pine Island to the Passamaquoddy tribe, returning a number of small land holdings to the Micmac Nation and Holton Band of Maliseets, and then this very large project on the East Branch, working with Trust for Public Lands for 30,000 acres, come back to my tribe, the Penobscot Nation, in the center of some of our most important cultural spaces on the East Branch. It's amazing, and it's so hopeful. And so, again, we're not going away. We haven't gone away for thousands of years. I think that we continue to press, but I don't know. I would be guessing if I were to say like, oh, they're beholden to this interest or that interest of, I think some of it is fundamental. I can only go on what they say, and I think it's fundamental that they fear change, or whatever it is.
Well, thank you for that nuanced answer. So the reason that I know this has been maybe a little more intense than people might have expected when you walked in, combination of Darren and I probably usually delivers that. And I
He wouldn't
just,
tell me. He wouldn't let me tell any of my jokes. That was
Yeah.
crazy, yeah.
to me, one of the things really important is the land justice work is sovereignty work, and it has to do with self-determination. And I thought it was incredibly important that people understand the current state of play in the state vis-a-vis the tribes, and it's shameful. And I think that one of the things that in my mind, I'm so inspired by the work that Darren and the folks around Land Return have done with our former students, with First Light, with many of the conservation organizations that are here, that have their roots here. It's really exciting to me to see, I'm hopeful and yet ashamed. So I think one of the things is that question of engaging, particularly with our political leadership, and ask them directly why they oppose self-determination. Every opportunity you get. So, questions from you all?
Just 1 second, Barbara. I'll ask you to just use the mic.
Yeah, to just go a little further on what you were just saying, both of you just saying. So I'm a Maine voter. I write the letters. I have gone to Augusta. I keep voting for these folks because I like them better than the alternative. And I hear you when you're giving us hope that maybe they're going to age out and new people are going to come with more ideas. In this moment right now, what else can we do besides signing the petitions and writing the letters and making the phone calls?
Yes, always a good question. I mean, I think the hard conversation. I mean, I'm an educator, so I'll always advocate for the education, the hard conversations with family and friends, even if you're like, I know they're probably not going to be on board, but I think pushing people in that sort of way, and in a delightful way, over tea in your garden, whatever it is you do. But I think there are financially, with the Alliance, Wabanaki Alliance, and then with the Commission in terms of our land return, there's so many things like those would be donlandreturn.org or wabanakialliance.com. These are where you can find those set of actions and frameworks. Encouraging young people to run for office. Todd mentioned this. The students are leading this work. I mean, we've had all sorts of issues, and University of Maine is really at the head of the data sovereignty movement. That Indigenous people, we should own our own sort of information and data. Our grad students and our students are pushing us. I mean, even pushing, sometimes non-Indigenous people saying, no, we want to push this harder. And I'm like, I don't know how people are gonna, I get nervous. And then they're like, I'm like, okay, let's just do it. Yeah, we can be pushed by our students and by young people and allowing for that space. So I know it feels kind of lame as an answer. I don't know how you had any other. Yeah.
I have one comment, Barbara. Yes, engaging with them through visits in Augusta. I believe that politically, what the Angus and Janet Mills in particular need to hear is in public forum, have somebody stand up and ask them, why have you opposed self-determination for the Wabanaki tribes? I think that's the one question that they need to answer publicly. And I think the letter writing, they get to see your letter and then they get to answer you privately. I think they're most afraid of publicly having to answer that question. And to be honest, Janet Mills has given the most mealy-mouthed, this idea that that there's a lot of uncertainty. Yeah, the world turns out to be uncertain at this moment.
So I wonder if Janet Mills and our Attorney General would make the argument that, so they say there have been all these lawsuits about the Settlement Act, but there are also all sorts of lawsuits in federal Indian law. And I'll be like, well, if you say 572 tribes and the number of lawsuits there versus the number of lawsuits for our 5 tribes with this one law, it's actually far more in terms of our unclarity of our Settlement Act compared to the federal framework of tribal sovereignty. So they make that argument, but I wonder if they'd make the argument that, raw numbers wise, more white people are killed by police than Black people, if they would ignore the demographic ideas that understand that there are, you know what I'm saying? Like, they would never make a similar argument as leftists in that context, but they will make it in ours. You know, they'll say, you know, that. Anyway.
Okay, I have a question. First
Sure.
of all, I mean this very respectfully, but I feel like I've come into a conversation in the middle of it.
Yes.
I don't have any background
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the subject whatsoever, so you're losing me a lot.
Mhm.
And I have a question, and I do mean it very respectfully. I want some clarity on what your goals are in asking for sovereignty. What does that mean to you?
Mm.
Because I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
I would just ask if you wouldn't mind repeating the question so it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
through real well.
What are we asking for sovereignty?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is your goal in asking?
Can I just ask you, what do you think sovereignty is?
Well, I think it's self-independence.
Independence?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I mean,
But-
there's just so many ways to define it. So I just wanted to understand where you're coming from with it. Yeah. So I think in that regard, our sovereignty as tribal nations is our ability to, you know, dictate the course of our lives and our cultures and our communities, right? It's just like, you know, that's like a common space. Like, well, legally we don't.
We
The
don't.
state of Maine intercedes and prevents us from acting in ways consistent with our treaty rights and the other federally recognized tribes. So I think that, so that's, yeah, and I apologize if we started at, you know, part C. So that's the issue here. But I'll go even further. The full sovereignty that other federally recognized tribes have also is not enough. It is an artifact of a colonial set of policies that refer to us as domestic dependent nations. So even in that regard, even though our rights as tribal nations predate in, the creation of the United States in its constitution, right? We never agreed to the social contract to be under the rule and authority. Certainly, I mean, you could argue in terms of the federal framework, but definitely not in the state framework where we have submitted to the authority and agreed, because we were here first, right? The social contract. So she's asking, do
If
we
you
have
could
legal
repeat that, yeah.
representation? Meaning, do we have representatives or do we have lawyers that go to the state? So, yeah, these are all great. These are all such important questions, Todd. I appreciate it. No, so starting in the 1830s, the two southern tribes, Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe, we had non-voting representatives to the state legislature, and that existed. So that's not, and we also couldn't vote as tribal people in the state. So to the extent that we didn't have any form of representation in a democracy, we don't really get that into the 1950s. And then the 1960s, we don't actually get fully enfranchised. So when my dad grew up, he was born in 1931, he knew no one who could vote, okay? So that's not a lot, that's just one generation ago. So the idea that we have been, blocked out of the deemed political process that we never even agreed to being a part of has been a part of our really recent history. And then so starting in 1967, there was a change in the Constitution that allowed for the tribal reservation areas to be actually represented in House and Senate districts in the state legislature. And then we also maintain these non-voting representatives that we have seen as our foreign delegates to a foreign power, right? So we weren't necessarily expecting them to vote. We saw them as
Ambassadors.
and we actually, so a couple of the tribes now call those positions ambassador and not representative to the state legislature.
And let me give you a quick example that I think may help with the sovereignty question. Anybody here a fisherman, fisherwoman, somebody who fishes, has a license for fishing at all? So if you're a tribal member on a reservation, theoretically the tribes control who fishes and who doesn't. But the state of Maine has been very, very careful about trying to ensure that hunting and fishing, which are the things that were guaranteed in the treaties that they signed, that they would have traditional hunting and fishing rights. And the state of Maine still asserts, because it does not view the tribes as sovereign, that it is the one who decides hunting and fishing regulations on tribal territory. So that is the best example I can give you, is like the state says, yes, you're sort of sovereign, but not really. You don't get to make that decision. And there are well.
Or you have that right, but we are regulating it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think is probably more the state's
Yes,
position.
yeah. Yes, you have that right, but not a.
Is that help at all? Yeah.
I think we have time for just one last
A very
question here.
adamant hand over here. Yes.
What is the financial benefit to the state of keeping the tribes from having sovereignty?
I'm not an economist, but I will say, so I don't know. I don't think it is a financial decision primarily. It may be a financial decision vis-a-vis certain interest in forestry, or they perceive it as a financial interest. I don't know if it actually is. You'd have to talk to them. What I can say, and this is, you can find all this information on the WabanakieAlliance.com, when tribes are healthfully sovereign, they benefit economically, and the communities nearby, the non-tribal communities, also benefit extremely well economically. So my argument, just to flip your question, would always be, why are you harming the Mainers that live near tribal communities who are not benefiting from the potential parts of our tribal sovereignty that would benefit those local communities? I mean, that would be the open forum question that Todd was saying to Governor Mills, why are you preventing the town of Princeton from benefiting economically from a more recognized enhanced tribal sovereignty of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township, Madocmigook, right? So why would you do that? I mean, she's going to not accept the facts as facts, but I mean, the studies are out there, the facts are out there that when we are thriving as Wabanaki, the communities near us thrive. And why? I mean, what is the interest of our, I mean, it can get super conspiracy rabbit hole-y. Like we could say, like, why is then the governor and certain constituents trying to keep people impoverished in the state for those particular? I mean, I can't answer that. I don't know if that's their intent or not, but it begs the question. So I think your question is a really good one. So yeah, I don't know what their economic interests are.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this as much as we did. I know we dragged you into the details. And I would encourage you to watch this space, because I think the college is very interested in helping educate people around these questions of sovereignty and self-determination as constant allies, we hope, not ones who pay attention and then don't, to try to really help educate people, because it's incredibly complicated. Wait, how are they not sovereigns? Yeah. Sort of, it is very complicated. Thank you for listening, and feel free to ask any questions afterwards. We'll be around. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Todd and Darren, for being here today. Thanks, everyone.